He lived alone until an Apache woman came in and said, "I won't leave here." Each morning, he woke just as the sun began to rise, its first rays spilling over the dry hills and lighting up the sparse trees and bushes around his home. The air was cool at first, carrying the faint scent of sand and wildflowers that grew stubbornly in the cracks of the rocks. He would sit on the worn wooden porch for a few minutes, sipping a cup of strong coffee, watching the sun climb higher and listening to the quiet whispers of the wind. He liked the silence. It was different from loneliness. Silence felt safe, predictable, like an old friend. Loneliness, however, sometimes crept in during the evenings when the shadows grew long and the desert seemed endless. On those nights, he would stare at the fading colors of the sky and think about the life he had once had, about the people he had loved and lost, and about the choices that had brought him here. His cabin was small, with walls made of rough timber and a roof patched with old metal sheets, but it was his. It smelled faintly of pine, dust, and the small wood stove that he kept burning for warmth. His days were simple, but they were full. He grew his own vegetables in a small garden behind the cabin, carefully watering each plant and checking for pests. He had learned over the years how to make the soil yield just enough for him, and how to save seeds for the next season. He would talk to his plants sometimes, joking quietly to himself, as if the beans and tomatoes could answer back. The work kept him busy and gave him a sense of purpose, a reason to get out of bed even when the morning seemed gray or heavy with clouds. Hunting and gathering were also part of his routine. He would venture into the hills and valleys, quietly moving through the scrubland, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. He had learned where the rabbits liked to hide, where the deer drank from the small creek, and which plants were safe to eat. These trips were not just about food. They were a kind of meditation, a way to be connected to the land and its rhythms. Even though he sometimes went days without seeing another person, he never felt completely alone when he was out there. The desert, with its harsh beauty and quiet strength, was a companion in its own way. Inside the cabin, he had a few books, some old photographs, and a small radio that he used to listen to the news or music on rare occasions. The photographs reminded him of his past life, family gatherings, childhood friends, and the love of his late wife, whose absence was a shadow in every corner. He would sometimes take a photograph from the shelf, hold it gently in his hands, and whisper a few words as if speaking to someone who could no longer answer. These moments were private, sacred, and filled with both sorrow and comfort. They reminded him of what he had lost, but also of the love he had been lucky to know. Despite his solitude, he had routines that connected him in small ways to the outside world. He occasionally visited the town at the edge of the desert to buy supplies, trade for goods, or speak to someone for a few minutes. The townspeople knew him as the quiet man who lived alone, and though they respected his privacy, they also sometimes left him small gifts, fresh bread, a jar of honey, or a newspaper on his doorstep. He never asked for these things, but he appreciated them, and they reminded him that even in his isolation, he was not completely forgotten. Some evenings he would sit by the window, watching the sky turn orange, pink, and deep purple. The stars would appear one by one, until the whole sky was filled with them. He liked to imagine stories about the constellations, creating lives and adventures for the stars above. Sometimes he would think about traveling again, visiting places he had only read about, meeting people whose lives were completely different from his own. But then he would remember the peace he felt in the quiet desert, the steady rhythm of his days, and he would smile softly, knowing that this place, as lonely as it could be, was also his sanctuary. He had learned to be careful and self-reliant. He could fix broken furniture, mend his clothes, and even build small structures when needed. Every hammer strike, every careful stitch, every planted seed was a small victory, a way of saying that he could take care of himself, that he could survive and even thrive alone. Yet, despite all his independence, there were moments when the silence pressed too close, and the emptiness of the house became noticeable. In those moments, he would talk quietly to himself, telling stories or recounting memories just to fill the space with sound, as if the walls themselves were listening. The desert had a way of shaping a person. It taught patience, resilience, and respect for nature. It gave him time to think and reflect, and sometimes it gave him small surprises. A sudden rainstorm that left puddles sparkling in the sunlight, a fox that appeared silently near the cabin, or the rare sight of a hawk gliding gracefully in the sky. These moments reminded him that life, even in isolation, was full of unexpected beauty. And yet, even in the peace and predictability of his life, there was an unspoken hope, a quiet longing for something or someone he could not yet name. It was a feeling that he did not fully understand, but that was always there, like a faint echo in the back of his mind. He did not know how or when this longing would be fulfilled, but he carried it with him, alongside his routines, his memories, and his connection to the land around him. In this rhythm of solitude, he did not expect change. Each day followed the last with gentle predictability. But as the sun rose one morning and the wind whispered through the trees, he could not know that this quiet life, this carefully balanced world he had built, was about to be touched by a presence he had never imagined. It would arrive without warning, reshaping his world and challenging everything he thought he knew about loneliness, companionship, and the small, steady comforts of his days. For now, though, he sat on the porch, his cup of coffee warm in his hands, listening to the soft desert wind, feeling both the weight of his years and the strange, comforting sense of being exactly where he was meant to be, alone, yet alive, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the world he had chosen and the memories he carried within him. He had just finished tending to his garden when he first saw her. She appeared at the edge of the small clearing in front of his cabin, standing quietly, but with a presence that seemed to belong to the land itself. At first he thought she might be lost, or perhaps a traveler passing through the desert, but there was something different about her. She did not look unsure or afraid. Her eyes held a quiet determination, and her posture was straight, as if she had a purpose that went beyond simply wandering. He wiped his hands on his worn trousers and stepped closer, squinting against the late afternoon sun. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice careful but curious. The desert had taught him to be cautious of strangers, but there was also a part of him that had longed for company, even if he would never admit it aloud. She looked at him steadily and said simply, "I won't leave here." He blinked. The words sounded strange, even stubborn, but there was no threat in her tone. She was not demanding, not aggressive, just certain. He felt a mixture of confusion and irritation. You won't leave." "Why are you here?" he asked, keeping his voice calm even though a knot of unease had formed in his stomach. The woman did not answer immediately. Instead, she took a slow step forward, the dry grass crunching softly beneath her boots. Her clothing was simple, made of sturdy material suited for travel, and a small satchel hung from her shoulder. The sun caught her dark hair, and he noticed the strength in her arms and the steady rhythm of her breathing. There was something almost untouchable about her, as if she had grown up moving through places where only the strong survived. "I need to stay," she said at last. "This place, it feels right. It feels safe. I cannot go back." He frowned. "Safe? You don't even know me." He wanted to turn her away. He wanted to go back inside and close the door, to return to his life of quiet predictability. But there was a strange pull in her presence, a sense of inevitability that he could not explain. It was as if the desert itself had led her here, and now there was no denying that something had shifted in his world. Over the next few days, the tension between them was palpable. She had moved into the small guest room in the cabin, a space he had rarely used. At first, he observed her from a distance, curious and wary. She moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, cleaning, arranging, and taking care of small tasks without a word. He noticed how she treated the furniture and the objects in the cabin with respect, as if they were part of her own story now. He tried to maintain his routines as usual. He tended his garden, checked the traps he had set for small animals, and repaired the fence around the cabin. Yet, everything felt different. There was an energy in the air that he could not name. The silence he had cherished for years was now filled with the subtle sounds of another life. The gentle clatter of dishes, the soft rustle of fabric, the occasional hum of a tune he could not place. One afternoon, as he worked in the garden, she approached him. "Can I help?" she asked, holding a small basket of fresh herbs she had picked nearby. He shook his head. "No, you should stay inside." But she did not retreat. Instead, she knelt beside him, placing the herbs carefully on the ground. She watched him work for a while, her presence quiet but unwavering. It was strange, unsettling, and somehow comforting all at once. "You work hard," she said finally, her voice soft. "But it is lonely here. Don't you ever wish for someone to share this with?" He paused, his hands gripping the garden trowel. Her question struck him in a way he had not expected. For years, he had lived without needing anyone else, or so he had thought. But hearing the words, he realized that he had sometimes wondered what it might be like to share his days, his meals, his small victories with someone who understood. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued his work, feeling the warmth of the sun and the quiet hum of life around them. As the days turned into a week, he began to notice small things about her. She had a way of moving through the cabin that was both careful and purposeful. She seemed to understand the land, the wind, the patterns of the sun, as if she had always belonged here. Sometimes she would sit by the window, sketching in a notebook, her eyes following the flight of a hawk or the path of the creek. Other times she would gather firewood or fetch water from the well, her actions steady and deliberate. He watched her with a mixture of suspicion and fascination. He did not understand why she had chosen this place, why she had decided not to leave. Yet he could not deny that her presence was slowly changing the energy in the cabin. It was no longer just a space for survival. It had become a place where stories, laughter, and quiet reflection could exist. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the sky turned shades of pink and gold, she asked him about his life. "How did you end up here?" she inquired, her voice gentle. He hesitated, then began to speak. He told her about his childhood, about the family he had grown up with, and the losses he had experienced along the way. He spoke of his wife, her gentle smile, and the ways she had made life brighter, even in difficult times. He did not talk much about the years immediately after her passing. Those were memories he preferred to keep private. But as he spoke, he felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, he was sharing his story with someone who seemed to listen without judgment. She listened carefully, nodding occasionally, her eyes reflecting understanding rather than pity. When he finished, she shared a little about herself. She spoke of the places she had come from, the challenges she had faced, and the reasons she had fled. She spoke quietly, never complaining, never seeking sympathy, but simply stating facts of her life. In doing so, she revealed her strength, her courage, and the quiet resilience that had carried her through hardship. Slowly, he began to see her not as an intruder, but as a person with her own story, her own needs, and her own ways of coping with the world. He began to appreciate the small things she did, the way she organized the cabin, the care she showed for the plants and animals, the respect she showed for the routines he had established. Her presence was no longer threatening. It was a subtle, persistent reminder that life could be shared, that even in solitude one could find companionship. There were moments of tension, of course. Sometimes he would grow frustrated with her insistence on staying, or with her quiet confidence that she could do as she pleased in his home. She, in turn, would challenge his routines, suggesting new ways of doing things, asking questions about his habits, or simply refusing to follow his instructions. But these moments never turned into anger or hostility. Instead, they became opportunities to understand each other better, to see the world from another perspective, and to recognize the strength in compromise and communication. Over time, a routine emerged that included both of them. They worked together in the garden, cooked meals side by side, and shared the quiet evenings by the fire. They spoke less and listened more, learning to read the small gestures, the subtle expressions, the rhythms of each other's presence. He began to feel a sense of comfort he had not known for years, a quiet reassurance that someone else could exist in his world without diminishing it, someone whose presence could be a gift rather than an intrusion. One morning he found her sitting on the porch, watching the sunrise with a calm intensity he could not ignore. "You belong here, don't you?" he asked softly, more to himself than to her. She smiled faintly, a small curve of her lips that spoke volumes. "Yes," she said. "And so do you." It was a simple statement, but it carried weight. It was not about possession or control. It was about recognition, understanding, and the beginning of trust. For the first time in years, he felt that he was not entirely alone, that his life, though still simple, could be enriched by the quiet presence of another human being who had chosen to be there. By the end of the week, their lives had intertwined in subtle but meaningful ways. The cabin no longer felt like a solitary refuge. It had become a shared home, a place where both their stories could exist side by side, where routines could be adjusted, and where companionship could grow naturally. He still cherished his quiet moments, his routines, and the land around him, but he also recognized that there was space for another life within his own, a life that could bring warmth, perspective, and unexpected joy. The man could not have predicted that this would happen, that a stranger would arrive and simply stay, declaring her choice with quiet certainty. Yet as he watched her move about the cabin, tending the small fire, arranging supplies, and sometimes just sitting in the silence with him, he began to realize that her presence was not a threat. It was a chance, an unexpected, extraordinary chance, to see the world differently, to open his heart slowly, and to learn that life, even in its quietest corners, could still surprise him. And so, the cabin, once a fortress of solitude, became a place of subtle beginnings. Two lives once separate were learning to exist together, learning to navigate trust, boundaries, and shared experiences. Each day brought small lessons, small victories, and small moments of connection that neither of them had anticipated. And in the quiet, golden light of the desert, something fragile and beautiful began to take root, a bond that would change both of their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet cabin that had once been his sanctuary of solitude now hummed with subtle life. The man and the Apache woman had settled into an unusual routine, one neither had expected, yet it slowly began to feel natural. They worked side by side, yet each remained aware of the other's space. He had never shared his routines with anyone before, and she had never allowed herself to rely on anyone else. The balance was delicate, but it held, like a careful dance that neither could fully control but both respected. In the mornings, they would wake to the soft light filtering through the wooden shutters. The desert air was crisp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dry earth, and the man often found himself watching her quietly as she moved about the cabin. She prepared breakfast with careful precision, arranging small bowls of oats, fruit, or fresh bread. He had grown used to cooking alone, but her presence made it a small ritual of companionship rather than a solitary necessity. They spoke little in those moments, but the silence was not empty. It was shared, comfortable, and full of the quiet understanding that had slowly developed between them. After breakfast, they would move outside, tending to the garden, checking traps, or repairing fences. The man had been self-reliant for years, skilled at every task needed to survive in this harsh environment. Yet, there was something about her presence that changed the work itself. He noticed that she had an intuitive understanding of the land, the way she could sense when a plant needed more water, or when the soil was ready for planting, the way she moved lightly but deliberately across uneven ground. He had always prided himself on knowing the desert, but here was someone who seemed to belong to it in a way he had never experienced. Sometimes, while working, they would talk quietly about small things, what needed to be repaired, which vegetables were ready to harvest, or where they might find firewood. These conversations were practical, yet they allowed them to learn about each other's minds, habits, and ways of thinking. He began to see that her insistence on staying was not about defiance. It was about survival, about choice, and about finding a place where she could exist without fear. Slowly, the edges of his initial frustration softened into understanding. Evenings brought a different rhythm. The sun would sink low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, and they would sit together near the fire. Sometimes they spoke of the past, memories, challenges, and stories that had shaped them. Other times they simply watched the sky, listening to the wind and feeling the subtle movements of the desert. He had spent years in silence, yet in those moments, silence felt shared rather than lonely. The presence of another human being brought comfort and even joy into the quiet that had once been only his own. Trust grew slowly, in ways that were small but undeniable. One afternoon, a sudden storm swept across the desert. Dark clouds rolled over the hills, and a strong wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending dust swirling around the cabin. They worked together to secure the shutters, stack firewood closer to the walls, and make sure the garden would not be washed away. The man realized as he moved beside her that her calmness under pressure was a gift. He had faced many storms alone, yet having another person who could act decisively, without panic, gave him a sense of relief he had never known. As the storm passed, leaving the desert sparkling with the remnants of rain, he felt a strange warmth toward her. It was no longer simply tolerance, it was respect and appreciation. He realized that he had come to rely on her presence in ways he had not anticipated. The woman, for her part, had begun to see him not just as a caretaker of the land, but as someone capable of understanding, kindness, and subtle humor. There was a growing sense that they were partners in this life, even if they had never spoken the words aloud. There were moments of tension as well. Sometimes his independence clashed with her confidence. He would insist on doing a task alone and she would gently but firmly intervene. "Let me help," she would say, her tone calm yet unwavering. At first he bristled at these interruptions, feeling that his autonomy was being challenged. But gradually, he began to understand that her help was not about control. It was about care, about sharing the work, and about building trust. Each small compromise became a lesson in patience, empathy, and cooperation. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she asked him about the people he had lost. "Do you ever wish things had been different?" she asked softly, her voice blending with the crackle of the flames. He looked into the fire, watching the embers glow, and considered her question carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted, "I think about the life I could have had, the people I could have been with, but I also know that life has brought me here to this place, to this moment. And somehow I am grateful for it." Her eyes reflected understanding. "I feel the same," she said. "The past is part of us, but it does not have to define everything. We can choose now, even if it is uncertain." These conversations became more frequent, deeper, and more meaningful. They shared not just facts about their lives, but feelings, regrets, hopes, and dreams. He learned about her courage, the dangers she had faced, and the quiet strength that had carried her to this remote desert cabin. She learned about his losses, his regrets, and the way solitude had shaped him into someone both self-sufficient and reflective. The man began to notice small changes within himself. He laughed more often, sometimes at her dry humor or the strange observations she made about life. He felt a sense of anticipation in the mornings, curious about what she might do or say. He began to see beauty in the small details, the way the sunlight fell on the garden, the sound of the wind through the trees, and the steady rhythm of two lives coexisting in the same space. Her presence also changed the way he interacted with the land. He began to listen more carefully, to observe more closely, and to think beyond mere survival. He appreciated the desert not only for its challenges, but for its subtle beauty. The way the cacti bloomed after a rare rain, the way the birds sang in early morning, and the way the stars lit up the night sky in patterns that seemed almost alive. She taught him to notice these things, to feel them fully, and to recognize that life could be vibrant even in the harshest conditions. One day, while they were gathering herbs near the creek, they encountered a small fox trapped in a fallen net. It struggled quietly, its eyes wide with fear. Without a word, they worked together to free the animal, gently untangling it and setting it back on its paws. The fox darted away, and they stood together in silence, both aware of the fragile balance between care and the wild. That simple act, helping a creature in need, symbolized the growing bond between them. They were learning to act together to protect, to nurture, and to respect life in all its forms. As time went on, the cabin became a place of shared history, a space where memories were made and routines intertwined. They celebrated small successes, the first harvest of beans, a repaired fence, a particularly beautiful sunset, each moment becoming part of the story of their growing connection. Even disagreements were tempered with understanding, as they learned that compromise was not a weakness, but a way to strengthen trust. The man sometimes marveled at the way the Apache woman had transformed his life. He had once thought that solitude was all he needed, that the quiet and the routine were enough. But now he realized that companionship did not diminish his independence. It enhanced it, made it richer, and brought depth to his experiences. He could still enjoy the quiet moments alone, but he also cherished the shared ones, the laughter, the conversation, and the quiet presence that made the cabin feel alive in a new way. One evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, she turned to him and said, "I feel at home here. With you, with the land, it feels right." He looked at her, his heart swelling with a feeling he had not expected, acceptance, gratitude, and something deeper that he could not yet name. "I feel the same," he replied. "I did not expect this, but I am glad." In that quiet moment, with the desert stretching endlessly around them, he understood that trust had grown in ways that neither could force or plan. It had grown through shared work, shared meals, shared stories, and quiet acts of care. It had grown in the small victories, the laughter, the companionship, and the recognition that life could be better when two people supported each other. And so the cabin, once a fortress of solitude, became a home filled with subtle connection, shared experiences, and mutual respect. Their lives were still simple, still shaped by the rhythms of the desert, but they were richer, warmer, and more meaningful than either could have imagined alone. Each day brought new lessons, new moments of understanding, and a growing sense that together they could face whatever challenges the desert and life might bring. The man had lived alone for so long that he could not have imagined this change. And yet, as he watched her move about the cabin, tended the garden, or simply sit quietly beside him, he realized that this unexpected presence had brought a sense of trust, companionship, and hope that he had never thought possible. Life, he understood now, was not meant only for survival. It was meant for connection, growth, and shared experiences that could transform even the quietest corners into places of meaning. As the weeks passed, the bond between the man and the Apache woman grew stronger, deepening, in ways that neither of them had expected. The desert, which had once been a place of solitude for him, now felt alive with the presence of another, Their days were full of work, but also of shared moments, laughter, and stories that built a quiet intimacy between them. The cabin, once just a shelter, had become a home in the truest sense, a place where two lives intertwined, shaped by the land, the seasons, and the small, meaningful actions that make everyday life worth living. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the trees, they set out to gather herbs and wild plants along the creek. The Apache woman moved gracefully over the uneven ground, her eyes scanning the soil and foliage as if she could read the land like a story. He followed her, noticing the way she paused to examine a leaf, to touch the soil, or to watch a bird flit from branch to branch. He had lived in the desert for many years, yet he realized that he had only scratched the surface of its beauty. She showed him patterns he had never noticed. The way certain plants grew near rocks that held moisture, the tiny insects that indicated fertile soil, and the subtle changes in the wind that hinted at approaching weather. They spoke less during these walks, but the silence between them was rich with understanding. Words were not always necessary. The shared knowledge of the land and the rhythm of the work created a sense of connection that ran deeper than conversation. Occasionally, she would teach him a new way to gather herbs or identify plants, explaining their uses in simple, patient ways. He found himself appreciating her wisdom and her gentle guidance, realizing that he had never truly considered the world beyond survival, beyond mere existence in the desert. In the afternoons, they often returned to the cabin to prepare meals together. She would wash the vegetables, chop them with care, and explain small details about how each herb or root could enhance flavor or provide nutrition. He began to notice that their conversations around food were more than practical. They were an exchange of culture, experience, and thoughtfulness. Cooking became a shared ritual, an act of cooperation and creativity that made even simple dishes feel special. Sometimes they would laugh over small mistakes, a burnt loaf of bread or a spilled bowl of soup, and these moments became part of the story of their growing friendship. The evenings were their quietest time, and they often sat by the fire together. Some nights they spoke of their pasts in more detail. The man shared memories of his childhood and youth, the lessons he had learned, and the quiet grief of losing his wife. The Apache woman shared stories of her family, her homeland, and the challenges she had faced in her journey. These conversations were not about dwelling on pain, but about understanding, empathy, and recognizing the resilience that had carried them both through difficult times. One evening, as the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, she asked him about the dreams he had once held. He hesitated, unused to speaking about hopes or ambitions, but her gentle presence encouraged him to open up. "I once dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world beyond these hills," he admitted. "I wanted to meet people, to learn new things, but life brought me here instead." She nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the paths we take are different from what we imagine," she said. "But the place where we end up can still hold beauty if we are willing to see it." Her words stayed with him. He realized that his life, though quiet and solitary for so long, had a richness he had not fully acknowledged. The companionship, the shared work, the quiet understanding, they were all forms of beauty that had only become possible because she had chosen to stay. Her presence reminded him that life could be more than survival. It could be connection, learning, and mutual care. There were challenges, of course. One afternoon, a fire broke out near the edge of the clearing where their cabin stood. Dry brush caught quickly, and the flames spread faster than they had expected. Panic would have been natural, yet they moved together with determination and calm. He fetched buckets of water from the well while she dug trenches to control the fire's path. Working side by side, their movements synchronized without words. When the fire was finally under control, they stood together, breathing heavily, covered in soot and dust, yet relieved. That day left a lasting impression. He realized how much he valued her courage and her calm in a crisis. He had faced dangers alone before, but having someone at his side, someone he could trust completely, changed the experience entirely. She, too, began to see him in a new light, not just as a man who lived alone, but as someone capable of resilience, planning, and quiet strength. The fire became a symbol of the partnership that had grown between them, a shared challenge that required trust, communication, and mutual respect. Beyond emergencies, there were small, everyday lessons they shared. She taught him new ways to cook with the herbs and plants they gathered, ways to preserve vegetables for longer periods, and techniques for repairing worn-out clothing or tools. In turn, he shared his knowledge of the land, where to find water during dry spells, how to track animals, and ways to anticipate storms. Each lesson, each exchange, deepened their bond and created a sense of mutual respect that was both comforting and empowering. They also shared moments of laughter and lightheartedness. He would sometimes playfully tease her about how carefully she arranged the herbs or about the elaborate way she cleaned the cabin. She would respond with a mischievous smile or a quiet remark that made him chuckle. These moments, small as they were, built layers of joy and camaraderie. They discovered that shared humor and simple playfulness could be as important as practical cooperation, creating a balance that made life in the desert feel more vibrant and less solitary. One evening, as they watched the sun set behind the distant hills, she asked him what he feared most. He thought for a moment, then admitted, "I fear that life will end quietly, without anyone knowing or caring. I fear that all this, my efforts, my memories, my existence, will vanish unnoticed." She looked at him steadily. "But life is not only about being seen by the world," she said. "It is also about the connections we make, the care we show, and the love we give. You are not alone anymore. You have shared your life with me, and that matters more than you realize." Her words touched him deeply. He realized that the solitude he had cherished for so long had also kept him from understanding the true depth of connection. Now he could see that life, when shared, was fuller, more meaningful, and filled with opportunities for learning, kindness, and growth. The seasons began to shift, and the desert showed its changing moods. Cooler winds swept across the land, bringing a crispness to the air. The plants in the garden ripened and were harvested, leaving behind small, neat rows of soil ready for the next season. Animals moved differently with the changing weather, and the days grew shorter. Through all of this, their partnership held steady. They adapted together, learning from each other, supporting each other, and finding strength in their shared presence. Through it all, they developed a deep trust. She knew when to speak and when to remain quiet, sensing when he needed space or comfort. He learned to recognize her moods and understand her intentions, seeing her not as a visitor, but as someone who had become an essential part of his life. Their trust was built not through grand gestures, but through countless small actions, sharing meals, helping with chores, laughing together, and supporting each other through challenges. One day, while sitting near the creek, she remarked, "Do you realize how far we've come? We came here as strangers, and now it feels like we've been building this life together for years." He smiled, feeling a warmth he could not put into words. "Yes," he said softly, "it is strange, but I cannot imagine it any other way now." In these moments, the man understood something profound. Life's richness did not come from solitude or control, but from connection, trust, and shared experiences. The Apache woman had brought more than companionship. She had brought perspective, courage, and the ability to see beauty and meaning in ordinary days. She had transformed his world, not by forcing change, but by quietly existing alongside him, teaching him to open his heart slowly and to recognize the strength that came from partnership. Their evenings continued with shared stories, quiet reflections, and small acts of care that deepened their bond. He found himself laughing more freely, thinking more openly, and feeling a sense of anticipation and hope that had long been absent. The cabin, once a place of refuge, had become a home in every sense, a place where trust, respect, and understanding flourished alongside the routines of daily life. And as the stars filled the night sky, stretching endlessly above the desert, they both felt a sense of belonging not only to the land but to each other. The hardships, the challenges, the laughter, and the quiet companionship had created a foundation that neither had expected, yet both cherished deeply. In the vast, open desert, they had found not only safety and survival, but a sense of connection, care, and shared purpose that made life profoundly richer than either could have imagined alone. Time had passed, and the seasons had changed once again in the desert. The man and the Apache woman had grown accustomed to a life that was no longer solitary but shared, quiet yet full of meaning. What had begun as a simple arrangement, her decision to stay and his reluctant acceptance, had transformed into a partnership built on trust, respect, and understanding. Each day, they discovered new ways to care for each other, to navigate challenges, and to appreciate the subtle beauty of the world around them. Morning light now brought a sense of warmth and anticipation that the man had not known in years. He would wake to the smell of herbs being prepared for breakfast, the gentle sound of water running in the kitchen, or the soft rustle of movement from the woman already awake and tending to her tasks. Some mornings, he would watch her quietly from the porch, noting the calm confidence in her movements and the attentive care she showed to even the smallest details. The routine was familiar, yet each day felt fresh because of her presence, which brought life and energy into the cabin in ways he had never imagined. Their mornings were often spent working together in the garden. He had learned from her how to improve the soil, plant herbs in a more efficient way, and use the natural patterns of the land to encourage growth. She, in turn, listened carefully to his knowledge of the desert, learning the subtle signs of weather changes, where to find water, and how to track the movements of animals. These shared tasks were more than labor. They were lessons in patience, observation, and collaboration. The garden, once a simple source of sustenance, had become a symbol of the life they were cultivating together, nurtured by effort, care, and mutual respect. Lunches and meals were a continuation of that learning. They experimented with flavors and textures, combining the herbs and vegetables they had gathered with grains and preserved foods. Cooking had become a ritual of joy rather than a necessity, an opportunity to share creativity and laughter. Sometimes he would find himself chuckling at her clever combinations of ingredients, while she would tease him gently for his stubborn insistence on doing things the old way. These small moments of humor became treasured parts of their days, simple reminders that companionship brought lightness as well as purpose. Afternoons often brought exploration. They would walk through the hills, observing wildlife, collecting firewood, or studying the desert plants. The woman had a way of noticing things the man had overlooked for years. The pattern of a hawk's flight, the delicate structure of a desert flower, or the tracks of an animal moving silently through the sand. Her attention to detail taught him to slow down, to observe more carefully, and to appreciate the richness of life that existed in even the smallest corners of the world. In turn, he shared his long experience with the land, teaching her techniques for survival and subtle ways to predict the weather or find hidden resources. Together, they created a rhythm that combined knowledge, care, and awareness, a partnership that grew stronger with every shared experience. Evenings had become sacred in a way that was both comforting and meaningful. They would sit by the fire, sometimes in silence, sometimes in conversation. On quiet nights, they would watch the stars emerge one by one, their reflections dancing in the dark sky, and talk about the past, the future, and the things that mattered most to them. The man sometimes shared old memories of his family, his wife, and the challenges he had faced alone, while the woman spoke of her own journey, her struggles, and the courage it had taken to find safety and belonging. These exchanges were never heavy or mournful. They were affirmations of survival, resilience, and the unexpected joy of shared understanding. One day, they faced a challenge that reminded them how strong their partnership had become. A sudden storm swept through the desert, darker and more intense than any they had experienced together. The wind howled, rattling the cabin, and rain fell in torrents, flooding small paths and threatening the garden. They worked together tirelessly. He secured the roof and windows while she helped protect the garden and moved supplies to safety. Their movements were synchronized, almost instinctive, shaped by weeks of cooperation and shared effort. When the storm finally passed, leaving a wash-clean desert in its wake, they looked at each other and smiled, knowing they could face anything together. That moment marked a turning point. He realized that the Apache woman had become more than a companion. She was a partner in life. Her presence had changed him profoundly. He was no longer simply surviving. He was living, fully aware of the beauty, joy, and possibilities around him. He had learned to trust again, to care openly, and to allow another human being into the spaces of his heart he had once kept sealed. For her part, she recognized the stability, patience, and quiet wisdom he offered, and how it had made the desert feel safe and nurturing in ways that only home can provide. They began to share more of themselves, not just stories but hopes and plans for the future. The man spoke of wanting to expand the garden, to grow more plants that could provide food and medicine. The woman shared her ideas for creating a small, peaceful space where they could rest, reflect, and enjoy the beauty of the desert together. They planned small improvements to the cabin, working together to create a space that was not just functional but welcoming, a home that reflected both of them. Through all of this, they found joy in the ordinary moments. Preparing meals, collecting firewood, tending the garden, or simply sitting together in the quiet warmth of the afternoon sun became moments of connection. He noticed how her laughter brought light to the cabin, how her careful attention to detail inspired him, and how her strength encouraged him to take risks he would not have taken alone. She, in turn, appreciated his steadiness, his knowledge, and his gentle humor that softened even the hardest days. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant oranges and purples over the hills, they sat together on the porch, watching the colors fade into twilight. She turned to him and said softly, "I never imagined I could feel so at home somewhere or with someone. This place and you have changed everything." He looked at her and felt a warmth he had not known in years. "I never imagined anyone could stay, and yet, now I cannot imagine life without you," he replied. His words were simple, but they carried all the gratitude, trust, and quiet love he had come to feel. The Apache woman smiled, reaching out to place a hand gently on his. It was a small gesture, yet it spoke volumes. In that moment, both of them understood that their journey together was no longer defined by fear, uncertainty, or solitude. It was defined by trust, connection, and the shared creation of a life that was meaningful, nurturing, and full of quiet joy. As the months continued, they grew even closer, learning new ways to care for each other and the land. Winter came, bringing cool winds and frost, and they worked together to protect the garden and keep the cabin warm. Each challenge, whether small or large, strengthened their bond. Every shared meal, every cooperative task, every quiet evening became another thread in the fabric of their life together. In the quiet of the night, they often reflected on how far they had come. He thought about his years of solitude and realized that, while they had been necessary for survival and self-understanding, they had also kept him from discovering the richness of companionship. She thought about her journey to this remote place and recognized that the trust and connection she had found here were far beyond what she had imagined possible. Their lives became a testament to the power of human connection. They had arrived at this point not through grand gestures or dramatic events, but through patience, shared experiences, trust, and mutual care. Every day was an opportunity to nurture their bond, appreciate the beauty of the land, and find joy in simple tasks that once would have felt lonely. Together, they had created a life that was richer, warmer, and more meaningful than either could have imagined alone. One afternoon, as they walked along a familiar path near the creek, she paused and looked at him. "Do you ever think about how different life could have been if we hadn't met?" she asked. He smiled, taking her hand in his. "I do," he said, "but I cannot imagine wishing for anything different. Life brought us here together, and I am grateful for that every day." She nodded, a quiet contentment in her expression. "So am I," she said. As the sun set behind the distant hills, painting the desert sky in hues of pink and gold, they returned to the cabin. The fire was already lit, casting a warm glow across the walls. They shared a simple meal, spoke quietly about the day, and then settled together near the fire. The night was filled with the quiet hum of life, the crackle of flames, the occasional rustle of a small animal outside, and the gentle sound of their breathing in sync with each other. The man reflected on the journey they had taken together. He had lived alone for so long, believing solitude was all he needed, yet now he understood that companionship could enhance life in ways solitude never could. She had brought strength, courage, laughter, and wisdom into his world. He had offered stability, knowledge, patience, and trust. Together, they had built a life that was balanced, nurturing, and full of meaning. And so, in the vast, quiet desert, they continued their lives together. Their days were filled with work, exploration, and learning. Their evenings were filled with stories, laughter, and quiet reflection. Their partnership, born out of necessity and choice, had grown into something profound and enduring, a life shared, a home created, and a bond that neither time nor circumstance could diminish. In the end, they understood a simple truth. Life is not meant only for survival, but for connection, trust, and shared experiences. And in the quiet beauty of the desert, they had found it, not in grand gestures, but in the daily acts of care, respect, and love that transformed two lives into one story of hope, resilience, and belonging.